Burlington Northern, the railroad. So he's picking up on what some of his friends always knew was his passion to follow all that. He called yesterday. He couldn't come, but he said, I have this and I have that. And I said, we have a lot. So, you know, but some of the pictures that you'll see he took at one time and so forth. Okay, we're going to cover three different things in detail. The first one is the Galena, Chicago and Galena Union is what they called it. And this is a blow-up of two railroads, and eventually they were all in the Chicago Northwestern system afterwards. The Pioneer Railroad started out of Chicago and headed out, and then it came up our way. But at Geneva, there's another one that headed straight through Dixon and Fulton and Clinton, Iowa, and so forth. And that was another base of their operations. I've got a lot of detail, and you'll have to go ahead and interrupt me if you want to add things, okay? The charter for the Galena and Chicago Union was January 1836, and there really wasn't very much of Chicago at that time either. They raised money by having meetings out this way and getting people to invest. The person in charge was William Ogden in Chicago. He'd been mayor, and he became the head of the Chicago Northwestern in the long run. By 1848, they had 25 miles of construction contracted. And they had a Pioneer steam engine that hauled the materials and so forth, and for a long time they had it around as an antique. By 1850, it had reached Elgin, which was 40 miles. And then it had slow times and fast times, but by 1852 in the spring it reached Belvedere, and in August the 2nd it came into the east side of Rockford. It didn't cross to the west side for a little bit after that. And by the end of 1853, it had reached Freeport, so it had come through here. And that was the key to our village of Winnebago, because it was called Winnebago Station or Winnebago Depot. There hadn't been much settlement except farms before. And so the town was laid out basically as the railroad came. This is a later picture of the station, and you're looking east, and that tall thing on the other side of Elida Street was the grain company, and there was also a creamery over there. They were locally owned and operated. We'll have more to say about damage to this building later. We have a whole lot of accidents that occurred one time or another. I'm going to move over a little so I can see it better. When they formed the Chicago and Northwestern system in June of 1864, there were 45 little railroads put together. A lot of them, they went west, but also up across Wisconsin. And we have another map here from 1869, and you might want to look at it later, but it also had another railroad that was part of the system that went out northeast from Rockford. It's where they called it Rock Cut, that area. It went through Harlem Village and then Argyle, Caledonia, and it ended up at Kenosha on Lake Michigan. So that was another branch that brought trade into Rockford. I got hold of the wrong ones, didn't I? Let's see. In February of 1859, an employee of the railroad was killed at Winnebago. It didn't explain what happened, but that was one of the first ones that were mentioned. By December of 1854, the IC Railroad, which had been set up long before, had a great construction from Chicago south, and it went all the way to New Orleans. And the other branch came down from Madison and went down. And in order to use the piece that went through here locally, they would send their trains all the way down to Centralia and all the way back up to Chicago until they built their own line, which was in the 1880s. That's Waynesburg, by the way. Okay, in 1879, there was another accident in which a lamp in the passenger area of the station was knocked over and the windows started to burn. They put it out, but it was another accident that occurred that didn't have to do with the train itself. In December of 1879, 1,975 carloads of stock passed through Aurora on the way to the stockyards. And that's what made each of these stations, as it was built out west, boom, was that the farmers all wanted to ship their animals and they would rush to the place, you know, so Winnebago had that, and then Pecatonica was opened, and then Freeport, and so forth. In April of 1881, there were boys that shoveled snow for the railroad, and then they didn't get paid, and they were complaining. Because they, you know, they did it on the hope of getting paid, but nobody had made it, had handed them money. In December of 1881, there was a group of 15 to 20 men replacing the old iron rails with steel ones. So they were upgrading the whole line. In July of 1882, boys were playing at that depot when they were switching things, and a little boy, 9 years old, Willie Francis, fell under it and he lost a foot. And I don't think he lived very long after that, but I didn't have an article that said that. I wrote too small. I even filled out something for a doctor once, and he said, "That's micrographia." And I said, "You didn't give me very big spaces."
Why don't you go ahead and just sit down?
Well, I
You could
could.
use your light better.
I told them that, but they said I should stand up.
Oh, well. I'm okay with you sitting down.
Thank you. In 1883, the newspaper said the railroad company was demoralizing the old depot. What they meant was they were remodeling it. It certainly needed, they said. 1888. Alan John, 30 years old, worked at the railroad station in Chicago, and he was killed there. Apparently, he stepped on the track when a train was coming by, and he left wife and child buried in Winnebago. His father was named Isaac John, and he had been the constable here. They didn't have much police presence until about that time, and so they had someone who had the authority to arrest somebody who got out of order, but they really didn't have weapons or anything. September 1907, they were advertising a world trip. Oh, no, excuse me. The train coming through town got off the track and continued to move, and it smashed the whole platform off the side of the building. And it also smashed the water tank that they had there to refill. They had replaced the water tank several times before, but this was a bigger one. October of 1908, there was a fire 2 miles east of Winnebago on the north side of the tracks. And it said 40 Emerson workers, that was from Emerson Brantingham before cases, were sent out to fight the fire, and it was soon controlled that way. Before Winnebago had a fire district or anything, if you had a fire here, they would send a group of men from the Rockford Fire Department out on the train and would try to fight it, but of course, just imagine what it was like after an hour or two. December of 1911, they're gonna schedule an earlier train going east at 7:14 in the morning. And it said that way the commuters to work in Rockford didn't have to rely on the electric, because by that time the interurban was going. Okay, 1915, dangerous crossings. And they talked about how the railroad went over US 20 west of Winnebago, and it had the double curve. I remember that. They didn't do anything about it, but that was the way it was set. And they were already they were already saying it wasn't safe. They had it until the 1960s, you know, where the car would turn and go under the bridge and then turn back again. It was officially 2 lanes, but it wasn't. It wasn't ideal. In 1916, they announced that their section workers would get, and the Chicago Northwestern would receive an increase. They were paid 14 cents an hour before, and they paid them 18.5 cents after the raise. These were the men that came out to repair the tracks or whatever, and they usually had cars that they stayed on, and they would have a project and they would go stay for a long time that way. In May of 1917, they said that the man in charge of the station and one other man were plowing up the railroad property and planting potatoes. This was part of the war effort, and it would have been one of our village park now. That was railroad property. No, when the library wanted to build there, they got it away from the railroad, and they turned it over to the village. So now actually the village owns it. If that was the only gain for some of those things. Okay, in 1919, a lady named Mrs. Annette Sherman Udall had been working 8 years at Western Union, which had an office in Winnebago for telegrams. And it said she intended to stay in Winnebago, but to work at Wisey's in Rockford instead. June of 1926, they were rebuilding. They had 150 men rebuilding a whole embankment at a culvert at McNair's Crossing, which is west to Keith Road. They'd had a flood and the whole fill had gone out, so they had to put it back. It said they put in hundreds of carloads of cinders, and it took 2 or 3 days before they could use it. And they even had bus service from Winnebago for those who would have taken the railroad otherwise for several days, every 2 hours. In August of 1928, there was a cut-in service in 1926. West of, there was no train west from Winnebago until 6:58 in the morning, and the train arriving the other way was 7:40 p.m. And so they were already cutting some of their service out. In 1928, there was a mail pouch that arrived soaked. They had at the depot in Chicago, they had a fire, and they fought it, and they soaked all the mail so that everything, it was run, they delivered it by train. In 1930, they were tearing down the wooden water tank and erecting a new one. 1935, Kerr Creek, which is by the old high school in Pecatonica, that tiny little creek along the road, flooded, and it undermined, and the train itself was derailed and burned. They said the damage was over 100,000 for that one incident. 1949, 3 freight cars were derailed in Weatherhead's pasture, which is on Conley Road just west of here. And they were going to stop using the depot for storage, and George McGee and Sons was going to get space and use it for their business. 1950, there was a crash at Elida Street, and 2 men in a truck that were crossing there were injured. April of 1950, the last passenger train was discontinued. They had run passenger trains through Winnebago for 98 years. And it said the mail would come from Freeport by truck instead, the other direction. Yeah, you recognize them. Those were some of the last ladies that were pictured in the Rocky paper trying to get them to keep the passenger service. The other lady was Laura Schoolmaker. In 1951, the fire department put out a fire in a coal car at Sanford and Zartman, which is at Pecatonica Street. They had it had been smoldering in there, and they didn't know it. And so once it started smoking, the firemen put it out, because that's where you called to get your coal delivered. In 1954, all of this is sort of a fade out of the railroad, but they had a little article that said total taxes paid by Chicago and Northwestern in Winnebago County was $51,438. And statewide, they were paying $1,532,111. And more than half of that went to school taxes. Because even though some of the schools were still small, they always hiked up the railroad's portion of the tax bill, because that didn't mean that the resident farmers had to pay it. It came out that way. 1968, freight cars were derailed at the Jacobson farm east of Winnebago. That's where Bob Rowley lives now, on Cunningham Road. 1971, the Interstate Commerce Commission gave permission for the railroad to abandon all tracks west of Winnebago. They still came to Winnebago for McGee's, had certain things they had delivered by train and so forth.
Don't forget this,
What's this?
that.
Oh,
That was
yes.
in the 60s.
Yeah, that was that culvert east of Meridian. And all of us remember when that's the west branch of Kent Creek. And it came roaring through there, and that's the tracks up above, see? And all they did to fix it was to put posts in and make a trestle. And when they closed the railroad altogether, they took it all out again. But it looked like the Wild West, you know, the way they left it that way. But you know, they didn't want to put a lot of money in it because it was fading. They were even sued in 1971 by a brakeman. He was on a boxcar, and the electric wires were so low that it swept him right off, and he was injured, and he wanted $300,000 for damages. He was suing the railroad and GTE, the telephone company. Then we had some pictures. Pat has, that's the last train passing through Winnebago that we had a picture of. And that's from the newspaper when they were taking out the tracks. They were scrapping everything. That was in 1982. And of course, since then, it's been turned into the Prairie Path, and the right-of-ways used by the power company with their big poles, and it's also used for people that are walking. The IC line from Madison to Freeport was the first one in this area that was done that way, and this other one would join it. There's also one in that line that goes through northern Boone County has been turned into a prairie path too, with a lot of plantings. That is the station building as it stands today. McGee's used it for many years. Now it's the Crossroads group has it for meetings during the week, because they meet at the high school otherwise. Well, this is a good time to ask you if you had any additional things from the line that goes right through town.
What's the building that Wayne, Warren Jones has?
That's the interurban building.
Oh, that was the.
That was the
Oh,
trolley.
I was
Yeah.
that was the railroad.
No.
Ah, okay.
Because the interurban used the street there. They had tracks in the street. It came out along US 20, and then it came through the fields where the soccer fields are now, and it joined Bluff Street, and then it went through town on Bluff Street, and then went and rejoined the railroad line afterwards. So on the way west, there were bridges for the railroad, and then there was a trestle bridge for the interurban right by it.
The interurban had their own tracks.
Yes, they
It
did.
wasn't standard with the railroad.
No, no. But in Rockford, there were trolley lines in the city, and they used them to go through. You know, because the trolley barn was where Lloyd's hearing aid place was at Kishwaukee and First Avenue. That was the car barn for all of the ones in the city. And the big difference was that was electric powered. We'll get to that. We've got things about that. Anything else about the railroad?
John, the building has, if you look at the old pictures, that one, the ground is level. So has that all been filled in?
I don't know whether they filled it in or they just lowered it down to the surface. Because they used it for storage, for whatever.
Because it was a lot higher in the,
Yeah, it had been, because you had a platform.
I recollect the early 1930s when my father drove two butcher cows from Montague Road to the railroad stockyards. And early 1930s.
In Winnebago, you mean? And that's where McGee built his building, in the corner there. That was all enclosures, yeah. Yes,
If you took a train east from here, were there stations where a traveler could connect with other railroads and go cross-country?
I think there were. Well, from Winnebago, you could, going west, you could go through Iowa, and there were a whole lot of farmers who loaded up their stuff here, their animals and machinery and everything, and got on cars, and they ended up in Fairmont, Nebraska. Because when we were on a trip with Wayne, we went to the cemetery there, and there were all the names from this area out there. And that was the efficient way to move, you know, because going by road would be unbelievably difficult. So they would just contract, and all those cars would be delivered at a certain time, and they'd ride too, you know. It was pick up your whole farm and go somewhere else.
Irv has a wireless mic here in case
Okay,
if any of you
that's
want to
good.
share. Just makes it a little easier to hear if you like.
What time is it?
7:10.
Okay. Why don't we have our break now, because I think the others will be slightly less detailed. We'll see.
Go turn the light on.
You are good, Irv.